There's a smell that never quite left some kitchens. Flour and a little bit of sugar, warming slow in a cast iron pan, on a stove that had seen better years. Outside, the wind moved through a yard where the garden had to work overtime, because there wasn't a choice. Inside, a woman stood over that stove, turning almost nothing into supper for 6. This was America in the 1930s, and what she made in that kitchen, with 3 ingredients, sometimes less, is something we're about to remember together. By the end of tonight, you'll know how a pie was made without a single apple inside it, and why that trick fooled families for years. You'll hear about the soup that was really just yesterday's bread, brought back to life with hot milk and a little patience. And wait until you see what's waiting at number 1, a dessert made from almost nothing but water, sugar, and faith, that grandmothers swore tasted like a miracle. Because that's what this is, really. Not a list of poor people's food, a list of what happens when love and necessity sit down at the same table, and love figures out a way. When the money disappeared in 1929, the grocery bill didn't stop existing. Families still had to eat, and mothers still had to find a way to stretch a pound of flour, a few eggs, if there were any eggs, and whatever the garden gave up, into 3 meals a day for everyone under that roof. Nobody taught this in school. It got taught standing at a stove, from a mother to a daughter, in kitchens where wasting so much as a heel of bread was something you simply didn't do. What replaced this world later on wasn't cruelty. It was ease. Supermarkets stocked to the ceiling, freezers full, drive-thrus on every corner. Nobody needed to make a pie without apples anymore. And somewhere in all that abundance, we quietly let go of a kind of genius that used to live in every American home. Before we start counting down, if you've ever tasted something at your grandmother's table that you've never been able to find again, hit subscribe now, because we're about to go looking for 25 of those tastes together, and this channel exists for exactly that kind of memory. Let's start at number 25. Number 25, molasses cookies. Every house had a tin of them somewhere, even in the leanest years. The kitchen would fill with that dark, almost smoky sweetness of molasses warming in the oven, a smell that meant something good was coming even when nothing else was. Molasses was cheap, where sugar wasn't, a byproduct of sugar refining that cost pennies and stretched a long way. Mothers mixed it with flour, a little fat, maybe a pinch of ginger if the pantry allowed for it, and out came cookies dense enough to fill a child up before supper. There was no candy budget in a house like this. Molasses cookies were the sweet a family could actually afford, the thing that made a hard week feel, for just a moment, a little softer. They didn't vanish because anyone stopped loving them. They vanished because sugar got cheap, and cookies got easier, and molasses slid quietly out of most kitchens altogether. By some accounts, there's a whole generation that still can't smell molasses without thinking of a grandmother's hands. Number 24. Fried green tomatoes. Every garden had tomatoes that never got the chance to ripen before frost came. Instead of losing them, women sliced them thick, dredged them in cornmeal, and dropped them into a pan of hot fat until the edges turned dark gold and crackled. The smell alone, sharp, hot, a little sour from the green fruit, meant supper was close. This wasn't a delicacy dreamed up for flavor. It was a rescue mission for food that would otherwise go to waste, turned into something families looked forward to. The frost still comes every year. What disappeared was the instinct to save what it threatened, because a grocery store nearby means you can just buy more tomatoes instead. Number 23. Cabbage soup. A single head of cabbage, a pot of water, an onion if there was one, and maybe a bone if the week had been kind. That was often the whole recipe. It simmered for hours, filling the house with a smell that clung to the curtains, and it fed a family for days, growing thinner each time it was reheated, but never quite disappearing. Old-timers remember mothers adding water before adding anything else, stretching that same pot from Monday clear through Thursday. Cabbage soup didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because refrigerators and grocery trips made stretching one pot for 4 days a skill nobody needed to keep anymore. Number 22. salt pork and cabbage. When there was a little meat in the house, it usually wasn't much. A chunk of salt pork, cured and preserved because refrigeration wasn't something every family could count on. Sliced thin and fried down, it flavored an entire pot of cabbage with just a few bites of real meat, the fat carrying the taste through every bit of the vegetable. This was protein rationed by necessity, made to feel like plenty through nothing but good cooking. Someone in that kitchen understood something we've mostly forgotten, that a little meat, treated right, could taste like enough. Pausa, 1933. Before we keep counting, it's worth stopping here for a moment. By 1933, roughly 1 in 4 Americans who wanted work couldn't find any. Not because they wouldn't work, because there simply wasn't work to be had. Families that had once lived comfortably were suddenly counting every nickel, and the kitchen became the one place where a mother could still fight back against circumstances she couldn't control anywhere else. This wasn't poverty as an abstraction. This was real families, in real houses, figuring out how to make one chicken feed everyone for a week, how to turn stale bread into something worth eating again. The recipes we're counting down tonight weren't chosen from a cookbook. They were invented, night after night, by women who refused to let their families go hungry, and who found, in that refusal, a kind of creativity history rarely gives them enough credit for. It wasn't all hardship either. There was pride in it. A mother who could feed 6 children on almost nothing wasn't just surviving, she was, in her own quiet way, winning. Let's keep going. Number 21. Cabbage and salt pork. When there was a little meat in the house, it usually wasn't much. A chunk of salt pork, cured and preserved, because refrigeration wasn't something every family could count on. Sliced thin and fried down, it flavored an entire pot of cabbage with just a few bites of real meat, the fat carrying the taste through every bit of the vegetable. This was protein rationed by necessity, made to feel like plenty through nothing but good cooking. Someone in that kitchen understood something we've mostly forgotten, that a little meat, treated right, could taste like enough. The cabbage would turn soft and silky, taking on the salt and richness, and what started as a head of plain cabbage became something a family looked forward to. Not because it was fancy, because it was theirs, and it was made with care. When supermarkets came, and meat was suddenly abundant and cheap, nobody needed to learn that trick anymore. A pound of ground beef became easier than knowing how to make 3 ounces of salt pork sing across a whole pot of vegetables. Number 20. Liver and onions. Liver was cheap because nobody wanted it. It was organ meat, the parts of the animal that were easiest to part with, and it showed up in butcher windows priced to move. But liver was also packed with iron and nutrients, and a mother who knew how to cook it could turn a small amount into a meal that would stick with you. Slice it thin, and it cooked fast. Fry it with onions, especially if you had onions, and the harshness mellowed into something almost sweet. The kitchen would smell like iron and caramel and butter, and a child who'd learned to eat it knew they were eating something that would make them strong. This wasn't delicate food, it was honest food, made for bodies that needed fuel and families that needed to survive on what they could afford. Liver and onions never came back, because abundance made us forget why we needed to know how to cook the parts nobody wanted. Now those cuts sit in specialty markets, expensive, bought by people chasing nostalgia or authenticity. A reversal so complete it would make those Depression-era mothers laugh. Number 19. Homemade pasta. In a house where flour was something you bought a sack of, you learned to make your own noodles. Flour, water, maybe an egg if there was one, rolled out thin on the kitchen table and cut into strips. It took time, yes, but it cost almost nothing. A woman would sit at that table with her daughter beside her, teaching her hands how to feel when the dough was right, how to roll it thin enough that light came through it. The pasta would dry on a towel overnight, and by the next day there was a week's worth of noodles, ready to go into a pot of boiling water with whatever broth or sauce there was. It was more than just food. It was a skill passed down, a tradition made practical by economics, but a tradition nonetheless. When dried pasta became cheap and readily available, Nobody had to roll noodles by hand anymore. And somewhere in that convenience, a kind of knowledge, the feel of the dough, the patience, the ritual, just quietly stopped being passed along. Number 18. Egg noodles. Before dried pasta could be bought for pennies, there was another solution: egg noodles, made at home with the simplest ingredients. An egg or two, flour, a tiny bit of salt, rolled and cut and dried, just like pasta, but richer because of that egg. In some kitchens, this was the fancy version, the one you made when you were expecting company, or when the budget had allowed for a few more eggs than usual. The noodles would go into chicken broth if there was chicken, or just hot salted water if there wasn't, and somehow, through nothing but the memory of that egg, they tasted like more than they were. When abundance came, these recipes didn't vanish because they stopped working. They vanished because we suddenly didn't have to work for our food anymore, and with that ease came forgetting. Number 17. Biscuits and gravy. A biscuit was flour, fat, and buttermilk, or sour milk if that's what you had, worked together just enough to hold a shape, then baked until the edges turned golden and the inside stayed tender. They were breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner, a blank canvas for whatever came next. The gravy was made from the drippings left in the pan after you'd fried a little sausage or salt pork, flour stirred in to thicken it, milk or water added slow until it came together, peppery and rich from the meat fat. It poured over those warm biscuits and disappeared into every crack and fold. A plate of biscuits and gravy cost almost nothing to make. A few pennies worth of flour, a bit of lard, maybe a small piece of sausage if the week had been good. But the feeling of sitting down to that, warmth, fullness, the sense that someone had made something just for you, that feeling was priceless. This was the breakfast that sent men out to look for work. This was what mothers made when there was almost nothing else to give. It didn't disappear because anyone stopped loving it. It disappeared because cereal came in boxes, and bacon came pre-packaged, and the time it took to make a biscuit from scratch started to feel like too much. Number 16. Cornbread. Cornmeal was cheaper than wheat flour in many parts of the country, and it stretched further. A simple cornbread, just cornmeal, flour, a little fat, buttermilk if you had it, salt and a touch of sugar, baked up golden and dense, with a slight sweetness underneath. It wasn't refined. It was sturdy. It stuck to your ribs. A pan of cornbread could be breakfast, or it could crumble into a bowl of beans to make the beans go further, or it could be wrapped in cloth and carried into the field. Cornbread was also a South and rural tradition, and it carried with it a kind of dignity. The dignity of a food that had fed people for generations, through slavery and poverty and hard times that cornbread alone couldn't fix, but that cornbread was there for anyway. When white bread became the aspirational American staple, cornbread got left behind as something poor and backwards. It's only in the last few decades that people have started remembering it was, all along, exactly right. Number 15. Milk toast. This one sounds almost impossibly simple, but there's a reason it lived in so many kitchens. Bread, toasted until it was dark and crispy, then placed in a bowl and covered with hot milk, sometimes sweetened with a little sugar or molasses if there was any. The toast softened into the milk, becoming almost a bread pudding, warm and filling and deeply comforting. For children, for the sick, for anyone who needed something easy to digest and warming to the soul, milk toast was the answer. There was something almost medicinal about it, the way hot milk and bread could transform into something that felt like healing. Mothers made it for fevers, for bad days, for mornings when nothing else seemed right. It required nothing but what was always on hand: bread, milk, heat. And yet it was treated like something precious, something made with intention. Milk toast disappeared not because it stopped working, but because we decided comfort should come from a box, and warmth should come from convenience. We forgot that sometimes the oldest, simplest things are the most honest. Number 14. Pea soup. Dried peas were among the cheapest proteins you could buy, and they lasted forever in the pantry. A pot of water, a handful of dried peas, maybe an onion, maybe a bone if there was one, left to simmer for hours until the peas broke down into something creamy and thick. The soup would thicken as it sat, the starches from the peas doing the work of cream or flour, and by the end of the day, it had transformed into something substantial enough to be a meal on its own. Old-timers remember this soup being made on Monday with one set of ingredients and then watered down and remade Tuesday, Wednesday, sometimes into Thursday, each version slightly thinner but still tasting like home. There was no waste in a pot like this. Every bit of nutrition stayed in the liquid. Every ounce of flavor was coaxed out and stretched as far as it would go. When fresh vegetables became available year-round, when soups could be bought in cans, the skill of making pea soup from almost nothing and having it taste like abundance just stopped being necessary. And like so many skills born from necessity, it mostly stopped being remembered. Pausa. The recipe as inheritance. Here's something worth noticing. Not a single one of these recipes came from a cookbook. Or if it did, it was a cookbook that had been rewritten 100 times over, in the margins and in the margins of memory, by women teaching other women in the only way that mattered, standing side by side in a kitchen. A daughter watched her mother's hands. A niece learned from an aunt. A neighbor passed a trick to a neighbor. The recipe lived in the body as much as in the mind, the feel of the dough, the smell that meant it was time to flip something, the knowledge of when water was hot enough without a thermometer. These recipes were currency in a different kind of economy, an economy of knowledge, of survival, of connection. When you taught someone your recipe, you were saying, "I trust you to feed the people you love. I trust you to remember. I trust you with the thing that kept us alive." That's why these recipes mattered so much. It wasn't just about the food, it was about being initiated into a lineage of women who had figured out how to make nothing into something, and who had decided that mattered enough to pass along. When the recipes disappeared, that transmission stopped too. A recipe isn't just a list of ingredients, it's a conversation across generations, and when we stopped cooking them, we stopped having that conversation. Let's keep going. Number 13. Hoover Stew. There's a cruelty in the name itself. Hoover Stew, named after President Herbert Hoover, who many Americans blamed for not doing enough to stop the Depression. It was a working-class insult baked into the recipe. Hot dogs, potatoes, onions, all chopped together and cooked in a skillet, sometimes with a little of whatever fat was available. It was cheap. It filled you up. And the name was a joke, a dark one, that let people laugh at their own circumstances. But the thing is, it actually tasted good. The hot dogs gave it a little richness. The potatoes absorbed that flavor. The onions sweetened as they cooked. A skillet of Hoover stew on the table meant supper was handled, and handled well. This recipe has almost entirely disappeared, not because it stopped working, but because naming your food after a president you're angry at went out of fashion. The dish itself, meat, potatoes, onions, lives on under other names, divorced from its Depression-era bitterness. But old-timers still remember what it meant to eat something named after failure, and to make it taste like defiance anyway. Number 12. Beans and cornbread. This is the combination that shows up in almost every kitchen across the South and rural America during hard times. A pot of beans, pinto beans usually, or whatever dried beans were cheapest, cooked with salt and whatever seasoning there was, until they were soft enough to almost fall apart. Beans and cornbread together made a complete protein, something nutritionists now know but Depression-era mothers simply understood through living. A plate of beans with a wedge of warm cornbread was enough. It was enough to build muscle on, enough to get through a day of work, enough to feel satisfied. There was something about the two together, the soft beans and the crumbly cornbread, the way the bread could soak up the pot liquor, the slight sweetness of corn against the earthiness of beans. It wasn't fancy. It was exactly right. When food became more varied and more available, beans and cornbread stopped being the staple it had been. It became regional, then nostalgic, then something you had to seek out on purpose. But in kitchens across the country, For decades, it was the thing that kept families going. Number 11. Bone broth. A chicken bone, a ham bone, a beef bone. Whatever had come from a meal was saved and put into a pot with water and whatever vegetables might be wilting in the pantry. This broth would simmer for hours, sometimes a whole day, the bones giving up their collagen and minerals and flavor into the water until it turned golden and rich. A pot of bone broth could feed a family for days. You'd drink it as a soup with maybe a few vegetables, or you'd use it as the base for other soups, or you'd mix it with rice or noodles. The nutrition was in the broth itself. Deep, real nutrition that came from slowly coaxing every bit of goodness out of something that most people would have thrown away. Grandmothers knew this instinctively. The broth was medicine as much as food. A child who was sick got broth. A person who was weak got broth. It healed and it nourished, and it was made from almost nothing. It's strange that it took us decades to rediscover what Depression-era mothers never forgot, that bones and time make something valuable. Now bone broth is trendy, expensive, sold in jars. But it started as an act of necessity and love, the same way most important things do. Number 10. Bread soup. This might be the most economical recipe of all. Yesterday's bread, torn into pieces, put into a pot of hot broth or just hot water with salt, maybe with an onion if there was one, maybe with a little fat to make it richer. The bread would soften and almost dissolve into the liquid, thickening it, becoming inseparable from the broth. What you got was something that was part soup, part bread pudding, deeply filling and warming. No bread ever got wasted in a house like this. Stale bread wasn't a problem to be solved. It was an ingredient to be transformed. A loaf that was 2 days old could become supper for a family of 6. There was a kind of poetry in it, taking the thing that had already fed you once and making it feed you again, taking something hard and making it soft, taking something that seemed finished and giving it new life. When bread became cheaper and easier to replace, when throwing away a stale loaf stopped feeling like a sin, bread soup just disappeared. But the instinct behind it, the refusal to waste, the creativity born from scarcity, that was something worth remembering, even now. Number 9. Fried dough. Take a handful of dough, the same dough you'd use for biscuits or bread, and drop it into hot fat. It puffs and browns and comes out golden, crispy on the outside, soft inside, and you dust it with sugar while it's still warm so the sugar sticks and melts a little. This was a complete meal for pennies. Flour, fat, sugar. 3 things that were always on hand. And what came out was something that felt like a treat, like a celebration, even when there was nothing to celebrate but surviving another day. Children would gather in the kitchen when fried dough was happening. The smell alone, hot fat and sugar, was enough to make the day feel different. And biting into something warm and sweet, even when the rest of the week had been thin, changed something in how you felt. Fried dough shows up in different forms across different cultures, but in American kitchens during the Depression, it was the dessert that required nothing but what was already there. It was democracy in a skillet. Everyone got some, and everyone knew it was made with care. It never disappeared because it stopped tasting good. It disappeared because store-bought donuts got cheap, and homemade fried dough started to feel like too much trouble. Number 8. Cracker pudding. Water crackers, the plain cheap kind that came in boxes, were a staple, and so was powdered milk. A bowl of crackers crumbled, mixed with milk that had been reconstituted from powder, maybe a little sugar, maybe a little vanilla if someone had splurged on a bottle. It was technically a pudding, though it bore almost no resemblance to what we'd call pudding now. It was more like a bread pudding's poorer cousin, soft, mildly sweet, filling. For children, it was a dessert. For families stretching a budget, it was a way to turn 2 cheap ingredients into something that felt like abundance. The crackers would soften into the milk, and somehow the whole thing became more than the sum of its almost nothing parts. There was something deeply pragmatic about it, taking the things that lasted forever in the pantry and turning them into comfort. It required no skill, no special ingredient, just the knowledge that sometimes simple is exactly what you need. When real milk became cheap and pudding mixes came in boxes, cracker pudding stopped being necessary. But there's still a particular kind of memory attached to it. The memory of making something delicious from desperation and having it actually work. Number 7. Ketchup sandwich. A slice of bread, a thin spread of butter if there was any, and ketchup. That was lunch for a lot of children during the Depression. Sometimes there was nothing else. It sounds almost impossibly spare, but ketchup had sugar in it, and salt, and enough flavor to make the bread taste like something. And if you were lucky enough to have a little butter under it, that changed the whole feeling of the sandwich. There's a hard honesty in this recipe. It's not trying to pretend to be anything it's not. It's a mother saying, "This is what I have, and I'm going to make it as good as I can." And somehow, for a child who didn't know any different, a ketchup sandwich could feel like lunch. The shame of it came later, the knowledge that some children had sandwiches with meat and cheese, that what you had was less. But in the moment, in the kitchen, it was just lunch, and it was what there was. This recipe has nearly vanished, not because ketchup disappeared, but because we've collectively decided that admitting we ever had to eat like this is too uncomfortable. Ketchup sandwiches live now only in memory, and in the stories people tell, and in the guilt of people who remember them and then had more. Number 6. Potato soup. Potatoes were cheap, plentiful, and could be stretched indefinitely with water. A pot of potatoes, boiled until soft, mashed or left whole, mixed with water or broth, seasoned with salt, and maybe a little onion or a scrap of fat. It was the soup that appeared in every kitchen that needed to feed people on almost nothing. And somehow, through nothing but the natural starch of potatoes, the slight sweetness they develop when cooked, the way they thicken a pot of water just by being there, it tasted like it belonged on a table. A family could eat potato soup for days, and each day it would taste a little different depending on what else went into the pot. Sometimes it was thin and brothy, sometimes it was thick enough to eat with a fork. Sometimes an egg got scrambled into it at the last minute if there was an egg. Potatoes saved lives during the Depression. They grew in gardens, they stored for months, they were nutrition you could count on. A pot of potato soup represented security in a time when security was hard to find. Now, potatoes come in so many forms, instant, frozen, processed, that the knowledge of how to make a simple pot of potato soup stretch across a week seems almost lost. But that knowledge was survival, and it was also love, and it deserves to be remembered. Number 5. Turnip greens. The greens from turnips were food that cost nothing. They came with the root vegetable, and most people threw them away. But a mother who knew how to cook understood that those greens were packed with iron and nutrients, and that they could be refogged with a little fat and salt into something that tasted green and alive and worth eating. Turnip greens had a slight bitterness to them, but when they wilted down in a hot pan with maybe a little bacon grease or lard, that bitterness softened into something almost sweet. They became a side dish, a vegetable course, a way to stretch a meal and add color to a plate that might otherwise be all beige and brown. There was a dignity in eating greens, a knowledge that you were feeding your body what it needed, even if what it needed came from the part of the plant that most people discarded. Turnip greens belong to a whole category of Depression-era cooking, the art of using what most people waste. When abundance came, when we could afford to throw away the greens and buy only the roots, that knowledge started to disappear. Now turnip greens are having a moment again, showing up on restaurant menus, priced as a delicacy. But they started as the ultimate in thrift, the thing that made nothing into something, and tasted like survival. Number 4. Pinto beans. A bag of dried pinto beans cost almost nothing and lasted almost forever. Cooked with just salt and maybe an onion, they became soft and creamy as they broke down, the cooking water turning slightly thick and rich from all the starch they released. A pot of pinto beans could be stretched across an entire week. Monday they were beans and cornbread. Tuesday, they were refried into a thicker consistency. Wednesday, they went into soup. By the time Friday came around, they'd been transformed a dozen different ways, and still nobody felt like they were eating the same thing twice. Pinto beans taught the Depression-era kitchen a fundamental truth. You don't need variety in ingredients if you know how to vary the preparation. The same beans could become 5 different meals just by changing the technique, the seasoning, what you serve them with. There was creativity born from constraint, and that creativity is something worth honoring. A woman who could make pinto beans taste like 5 different things wasn't just stretching a budget, she was practicing an art form. Number 3. Cornbread. Cornmeal was cheap where wheat flour wasn't, and cornbread was the answer to how you fed a family when wheat was too expensive. It was sturdy, slightly sweet, dense enough to stick to your ribs, and last through a day of work. The cornbread would come out of the oven golden, and families would eat it hot with butter if there was butter, or with a little honey if there was honey, or plain if there wasn't anything else. It didn't matter. Cornbread was good no matter what. There was also something regional and historical about cornbread. It carried the story of America with it, the cornmeal that came from Native American agriculture, the tradition that had fed people through centuries of this country's history. Eating cornbread wasn't just practical, it was belonging to a tradition. When white bread became the aspirational American staple, refined, soft, packaged, cornbread started to feel like something poor and backwards. It's only in recent years that people have started to understand it was never those things. It was, all along, exactly right. Number 2. Vinegar pie. This is where the ingenuity gets almost impossible to believe. Vinegar pie, a dessert made with vinegar, sugar, water, butter, and flour. No eggs, no cream, no fruit. Just these 5 things mixed together, baked until it sets into something that tastes almost like a chess pie or a sugar cream pie. The sourness of the vinegar plays against the sweetness of the sugar. The water and butter become a custard-like filling all on their own. The crust holds it together, and what comes out is a dessert that has no right to taste as good as it does. This recipe lives in the border between desperation and genius. A mother with nothing in the kitchen but basic staples, reaching into that pantry and pulling out something that tastes like a miracle. That's what vinegar pie represents. It required not just knowledge, but confidence. Confidence that these 5 things, combined in this specific way, would actually work. Confidence that her family would eat it and enjoy it. Confidence born from years of making something from almost nothing. Vinegar pie is almost completely forgotten now. You have to search for it, dig through old recipe collections, ask the right grandmother. But when you make it, when you taste it, you're tasting the difference between having and not having, and how a woman decided that difference wouldn't matter. Pausa, why we forgot. These recipes didn't disappear because they stopped working. They didn't disappear because they tasted bad or failed to nourish. They disappeared because, slowly and then all at once, we didn't have to do this work anymore. After the war, after the factories started producing food instead of ammunition, after refrigerators became standard and supermarkets lined every street, abundance came. Real abundance. Not the imagined kind, but the actual kind where you could walk into a store and buy almost anything you wanted for almost any season. And with that abundance came a choice, mostly unspoken. We could forget the knowledge that had kept us alive when we had nothing. We could let go of the recipes, the techniques, the deep understanding of how to stretch and transform and create. It wasn't a bad choice, exactly. It was a human choice. When you don't have to do something to survive, it's natural to stop doing it. But something was lost in that forgetting. Not just recipes, a kind of knowledge, a connection to the people who invented these dishes out of pure necessity and will. An understanding of what it means to make something out of almost nothing, and to make it with love. These recipes didn't disappear because the world got better, though in many ways it did. They disappeared because we got comfortable enough to forget why we ever had to know them in the first place. But that knowledge is still there, written down now, waiting to be remembered. And maybe that's enough. Maybe remembering by itself is a kind of gratitude. Let's go to number 1. Number 1, water pie. Water pie might be the most honest recipe ever invented. Flour, sugar, butter, water. That's all. No eggs, no cream, no milk, no fruit. Just the 4 things that were always in the pantry, no matter how empty everything else had become. You make a pie crust if you know how, or you line a pan with biscuit dough if you don't. You mix the flour and sugar together. You add the butter, cut into small pieces. You pour water over it, not into the filling, but on top of it, and then you bake it. And as it bakes, something happens that seems impossible. The water dissolves the sugar, the flour thickens it, the butter enriches it, and what comes out is a custard-like filling, creamy and sweet, that tastes nothing like its ingredients, and everything like a miracle. A mother would make this when there was nothing else, when the cupboard had been picked clean, when the garden had given up everything it had to give, and her children would taste it and know, not from her words, but from the pie itself, that their mother had refused to let them go without sweetness, that she had looked at 4 basic things and seen abundance. There's a story that gets told about water pie, about how during the Depression, a child tasted it and asked what kind of pie it was, and the mother said it was whatever pie they needed it to be, that it was enough because she made it, that it tasted like love because love was the only thing that made it possible. This pie represents something we've almost completely lost, the ability to look at scarcity and see possibility instead of limitation, the willingness to try something that shouldn't work and make it anyway, the kind of creativity that only comes when you have no choice but to be creative, and you choose to make it beautiful. Water pie is almost entirely forgotten now. Most people under 60 have never even heard of it. But somewhere in an old recipe collection, or in the fading memory of someone who watched their grandmother make it, it still exists. And every time someone rediscovers it, every time they mix water and sugar and flour and butter and watch it transform in the oven, they're tasting history. They're tasting survival. They're tasting a woman's refusal to accept that nothing was the same as not enough. These recipes lived because people needed them. They disappeared because people stopped needing them. But the memory of them, the knowledge that we once knew how to make something from almost nothing, that we once understood how to stretch and transform and create, that memory is still worth keeping. Which of these would you make if you could? Which one did your family make? Which recipe sits in your memory, tied to a kitchen you haven't walked into in decades? Tell me in the comments. Tell me if your grandmother made any of these. Tell me if you've ever tasted water pie, or if you're brave enough to make it now. This channel exists because of those memories, because of that connection we all share. The taste of something that mattered, the memory of someone who cared enough to make it, even when they had almost nothing to work with. The comments are where we remember together. And if you want to go back and remember another piece of what we lost, watch the previous episode, 25 Forgotten Drive-In Theater Memories from the 1950s that vanished forever. There's a whole world waiting in there, a different kind of memory, a different kind of loss. Subscribe so you don't miss what we're remembering next.